Welcome to the World Football Summit podcast, the show for football industry leaders who want to stay ahead of the game. We bring you the latest insights, trends, and stories from the experts driving innovation and progress in sports business worldwide. Join us as we dive deep into the ideas and initiatives transforming the world of football. From sustainability and innovation to player development, fan engagement, and everything in between. Our goal is to unite the global football industry and drive positive change and progress.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the World Football Summit podcast. I'm your host, Jaime, CMO at World Football Summit. Today, we welcome one of the best sports business broadcasters in the game, Ben Jacobs, who I was looking forward to welcoming to the show since we met at WFS Asia, joins us for a wide-ranging conversation that covers the Saudi Pro League and its ambition to become a top-tier football league, the impact that Messi has had on the MLS, a tour of the European football industry, the English Premier League, broadcasting rights, Manchester United, Chelsea, the Superleague. Yep, this one definitely has it all. Before going into it though, don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast on your platform of choice and share it with your industry colleagues. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, where every week we send updates, trends, and everything that goes on at our events. You can find the link in the show notes. Remember, this 2024 is going to be a busy one for World Football Summit, as we have events in London, Mexico, Sevilla. You can check it all out on our website, and hopefully we'll meet you there. And now, enjoy this episode with Ben Jacobs. Well, Ben, welcome to the World Football Summit podcast. It's great to have you here after we've met in Saudi Arabia. Been looking forward to having you here, so finally made it happen.
Delighted to be here. I enjoyed the conference in Saudi Arabia. Looking forward to the next one, and I'll chat over the next 45 minutes or so.
Yeah, definitely. So before we go into many of the topics that we want to discuss, just for those out there that don't know who you are, you can briefly introduce yourself. And more importantly, very briefly, tell us, what is it that you do, what you do?
Big question indeed. Well, the easy part is explaining what I do. I'm a Premier League commentator and a Middle East correspondent with the UK radio station TalkSport. I was at CBS before that. So I'm a sports broadcaster and I love being at live events, whether that's matches or conferences. And I do what I do, I suppose, because I was never good enough to play sports. So the next best thing you can do is talk about it. But I'm fascinated by the evolution of the industry and the way that as a broadcaster, we have to kind of adapt to modern times, which means being more digitally orientated, which means focusing on things like podcasts and obviously networking at conferences. And the great thing I think about World Football Summit as a broadcaster is there's a whole different demographic there that you wouldn't normally rub shoulders with or meet, not in one place anyway. So it's priceless, I think, as a member of the media to come to conferences like the one in Saudi Arabia, learn industry insights, which are very genuine and authentic, and then go off and talk about it, which is the part that I enjoy the most about this job.
Well, thanks for those words. I agree. But you know what? I think the quality of the conference is actually determined by the quality of the people that go there. So, it's goes both ways, right? Anyway, Ben, since we met at Saudi Arabia and we're going to discuss a lot of dynamics going on in the industry, let's just start there in Saudi. So, do you think all of these, movements around PIF acquiring European or players playing in Europe for top dollar, do you think this is going to keep on going? Is this trend going to continue? Is it going to change football? What do you think?
Well, I think Saudi Arabia mean business, and what we've seen so far is only the beginning. So there's kind of two milestones. One is the Vision 2030, which is all about promoting sport and bringing it to Saudi Arabia, and in doing so, creating a culture of a healthier lifestyle and jobs that are not as reliant on the oil and gas industry. And then we have a more focused football-specific target now, which is the 2034 World Cup. And everything Saudi Arabia do in football in particular, but broader sport as well, is going to build up to these two deadlines. So everything now that we've seen is only the beginning. And it's fast moving and it's ambitious and it's exciting, but it's not flash in the pan. And it's only a tiny proportion of what is still to come. And this is why I think we have to judge Saudi Arabia not now, but maybe in 5 years' time or even longer. So anything promising now in terms of ambition or spending or infrastructure is only going to get bigger and better. So I expect Saudi Arabia to be here to stay. But also, I think they'll disrupt, a bit like Qatar did in the build-up to their World Cup, sport in different ways, because we're going to see it more intertwined with entertainment, with socially conscious projects, with government strategy, with job creation. And we're not kind of used to seeing that in more developed countries. And some will call it a sports strategy, and others will call it sports washing. But I don't think that those behind the sport are really bothered by the label. What they're looking for is a tangible return over many years to tick all of these boxes. And some of the boxes relate to business, some relate to an eventual return on investment, some relate to tourism, some relate to lifestyle, and some are just simple sports goals, like give people the joy of football or other sports within Saudi Arabia. So the money's there, the ambition's there, and as the infrastructure catches up, then it's clear that Saudi Arabia are going to be a major player in sport, and arguably already are.
Yeah, I agree. And you know what I mean? The key of what you said there is that, and this is what I tell people when they ask me, it goes far beyond the sport itself. There's a country vision behind it. There's macro goals in there. There's job creation, there's employment, there's tourism, and that makes it more robust project, if you will. But I'm wondering, how does this impact call it the sport business model? So all your levers, your commercial, your broadcasting, your match day revenues across the entire world. How do you see that?
Well, I think those outside of Saudi Arabia in sport are going to have to work out how to play ball with Saudi Arabia and inverse almost what's happening at the moment. So right now we're seeing Saudi ambition, Saudi spending, sport coming to Saudi Arabia. And of course, in the short term, the influx of money can benefit leagues and clubs in particular. So when an Italian Super Cup comes to Saudi, or La Liga, or even a conference like World Football Summit, then there can be money involved and businesses can capitalize upon that. But over time, as the Saudi market becomes more dominant, even more so than now, and it has football and tennis and golf and boxing and so on, I think that leagues and clubs are going to have to understand how they can benefit from that, not just financially, but also in new ways. And it might be an inversing of the trend of only Saudi Arabia bringing things to Saudi Arabia and paying for them. There might also be opportunities for clubs and leagues to do partnerships and commercial deals with Saudi companies and benefit directly on home soil, if you like. But also the player influx into Saudi might go the other way. And we may see over time as Saudi players or those in the Middle East and North Africa or any player that's succeeding in the Saudi Pro League becoming marketable to clubs in Europe or North Central and South America. So right now it feels all about Saudi Arabia disrupting and taking things to Saudi and paying whatever price is necessary. But there will in the longer term be a need for return on investment for the Saudis. And that won't always be monetary, because you can say you can put a value on global audience, you can put a value on tourism and so on. But nonetheless, further down the line, it won't just be about overpaying and showing ambition over a short period of time. It will stabilize. And when it stabilizes, leagues, clubs, federations, and so on will look to work out how they can get a piece of the pie, or as the league improves, how they can benefit from that league and maybe make it more of a two-way trade. And I think that in the Saudi Pro League in particular, there's also new rules coming in regarding quotas. And those quotas have 8 players that exist now as foreigners, plus an extra 2. And I say plus an extra 2 for 2 reasons. One is because the requirement will still be that you can only in any given match day squad field 8. So you can have 10, but you can only use 8 in a match day squad. But second of all, of that 10, 2 have to be born in 2003 or afterwards. So then that creates a desire for Saudis to sign younger foreigners. They have to, if they're going to fill that full quota. And that might mean that they can loan talented players that are of a very high level, and it's only temporary, but it suits a club and it suits a player and it suits the Saudis, and everyone kind of wins in that scenario. So again, that's just one example, a very specific example of a small shift in the rules that allows a better two-way, and that's the key word, relationship between the Saudi deal makers thinking about the wider sports strategy, in this case, specifically in the Saudi Pro League, and clubs, leagues, and federations. And instead of it being Saudi only disrupting and therefore maybe unsettling some other leagues or clubs or federations or players, I think we're going to see much more of an amicable two-way relationship over time. And that's the way that the model will change. And people are going to want a piece of the Saudi pie rather than either dismissing it or being fearful that it's a threat.
Agree. And to your point about being two-way, which I completely agree with that concept. You would imagine that the local Saudi talent is going to develop over time, as you know, because that's the whole point of it, right? It doesn't really make sense if you're bringing Cristiano Ronaldo if the local player doesn't learn from him. And talent, and then you would imagine those local players would also be interested at some point of traveling or playing it at leagues, not only in Saudi, So it's the market at the end of the day, So and in that sense, I was doing some research, and the Saudi Pro League has big ambitions. Right now I think the valuation of the league is around 800 million, and they plan to increase that to $2.1 billion now, by 2030. So, do you think this is realistic?
Yeah, I think it's realistic. I think that the desire to increase that type of revenue has always been there. It's part of long-term strategy. We see this in any league. You have to think about incremental increases, and that will often come from your international market. So if you take Saudi Arabia, they'll start with a base number that they're able to get with their domestic rights. And of course, it's a large number that they can bring in, and then that helps them distribute that via the clubs. And because they've got centralized spending, go bigger with each window. And it's very easy for them to do that domestically simply because there's a big appetite and they're increasing stars in their league. And then the challenge there is, how do you hit bigger numbers incrementally, season on season or cycle on cycle, to your international audience? Then if you flip it and come back to the Premier League or La Liga, those kind of rights already have a large pool of interest and big numbers. And domestically, it's never been a problem to sell again because there's a lot of competition. If we think about the UK with TNT Sports and Sky Sports and Amazon, and then there's radio rights for TalkSport as well, there's a lot of competition. And as the league gets better and more international, and it's bizarre to talk about the Premier League getting better and better, but it obviously is in terms of quality, in terms of fan engagement, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of partners. So just because it's the best league in the world, it doesn't mean that it can't keep improving. And then the global audience comes from the fact that those outside of England want the best. So Saudi Arabia are trying to be the best, not just because they want to blow away their competition, but because they realize that there's a big pool of money that you can gain from an international audience. And once you accept that you're not in the country where the sport takes place, the be-all and end-all as a broadcast partner is to get the best product, because that's how you sell subscriptions. That's how you get a TV audience. And therefore, every league is trying to target that international market, but you can only really do so if you've built a marketable product that resonates with a global audience. And I think ambitious targets are set in particular for international TV revenue for that very reason. And the Premier League is in a privileged position because it knows that it's offering at the moment anyway the best product in the world. So the numbers are always going to cycle on cycle, get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the clubs can obviously budget and plan for that. What's interesting, though, in terms of the change we may see, is once the level of product and audience globally specifically, when there's no blackouts, when you can see every game, gets to a certain level, then you might be able to go direct to consumer, which is still quite a contentious and bold approach, because at the moment we think of the leagues needing the broadcast partners, and the broadcast partners do a lot. They film, they offer stats, they help with infrastructure and strategy, and they're trusted. But at the same time, the Premier League has got Premier League productions. Serie A, I'm told, are thinking about going it alone globally. And we know in other sports like NBA Pass exists. So direct to consumer is this new sort of twist, because if you use the broadcast partners to build to a certain level, and then you realize you don't need the broadcast partners, then you can go direct to consumer potentially, or you can have your cake and eat it. You can go direct to consumer, but you can still offer linear TV games in a non-exclusive manner or a select amount of exclusive games while still having this kind of pass that has everything. And that's very much the NBA model. And when you do that, you may be in a position where the consumers prefer that, because if they're international and there's no blackouts, they would much rather pay one fee for a consistent kind of presentation and be able to either see every game or pay for a certain amount of games, maybe for a select team, and know that they don't have to move about. And everyone's very comfortable now moving away from linear TV and watching something on their iPad or their mobile phone or their laptop, or a bit of both, because you can have a primary experience watching something live and a second screen experience at the same time. So this is where the industry is changing, and this is where I feel that the revenue that is possible for a league in particular is being rethought out, because there's this kind of guaranteed, if you're a superior product, ability to bring in domestic and international rights. And on top of that, there's new revenue streams that you can consider, whether that is going direct to consumer, or if you choose not to go direct to consumer, you can still say, well, here's our relationship with a broadcaster that gets us X, such as some of the numbers that you've spoken about. But maybe we have creator-led rights. Maybe we have a non-live form of upsell to somebody in the market out there. The BBC, for example, are increasingly taking on highlights packages only, as opposed to full games, because that's kind of what young audiences like. Short, snappy, just to see something straight afterwards and then be able to share it. So leagues are getting creative because they realize that the more they dilute the different types of rights or packages, the more they can sell to multiple partners, and then the bigger income they can bring in.
Yeah, and the key there is you have to balance, no? When you go direct to consumer, the benefit there is obviously you get more access to the fans' data, and then you can do so much with it. You can personalize the fan experience much more. On the other side, if you already have a big broadcasting rights deal, it's really hard to let that go. But the thing for Saudi is they don't have that pressure, because they don't really have that legacy, if you will, behind it. So they're at a moment in time that they can build, as you said, a marketable product, and they can also have the funds to invest in a direct-to-C proposition, a direct-to-fan proposition. It's just super interesting. And in that regard, one of the most interesting deals that we saw was the one with Apple, where they actually gained global distribution rights to the MLS. And it goes back to the valuation topic we were discussing before, no? You see that soccer, quote unquote, is becoming embedded in the culture of the American sports, no? So you have Messi, you have Ted Lasso, you have Ryan Reynolds with Wrexham. And then the valuations of the MLS franchises are just going through the roof, right? I mean, and not only in MLS, but also in the NWSL, no? So American soccer in general. So again, if you look at some numbers, you see LAFC, they valued at 1 billion, where, for example, Newcastle, I think it's not more than 400 and 600 million. So I don't know if that makes sense, but again, do you think that's sustainable going to the other side of the world in the United States?
Yeah, I think it's sustainable. And I also think there's no guarantee that any league will maintain its dominant position in the market. And therefore, as football expands to America, for example, with the World Cup and the expanded Club World Cup in 2025, we will see improvements in infrastructure and revenue that allow big signings. We know that the Messi signing to Inter Miami was very novel, because even though they couldn't match the Saudi Arabia offer, they were kind of able to give him effectively a cut of the Apple deal. And that meant that it was far more appealing. And once you've got Messi, why can't you get 100 other players in the same way that Saudi Arabia got Cristiano Ronaldo? And then in the following summer, 94 foreign stars arrived to the Saudi Pro League. So America's really interesting because, as you say, some of the clubs have got big followings, and not just in the men's game either. The NWSL has got tremendous communities and fan bases. You look at Gotham, for example, winning the NWSL, and that type of community and fan base is invaluable as you look to grow, because the people that turn up to the games are equally heavily invested within the community as well. And maybe they do a lot more than the traditional football fan. And that might mean reaching into their pocket to help a football/community project, but it also might mean paying a bit more to subscribe and watch their team. And the advantage to a TV partner in America as well, even though it's arguably a disadvantage as far as football culture is concerned, in my opinion, so that's the sort of paradox, is the geography of America is so big that most fans can't or don't travel to away games. And that creates a window of opportunity where if you're airing that game on a subscription service, of course, more people are going to pay for it because far less people are traveling. So it actually perversely kind of helps the TV partner. So I think within America, the aim is obviously to raise the level of the MLS, of the NWSL, of the USL, which is men and women's. There's a great new league run by Amanda van der Voort in the USL on the women's side that's going to be starting in 2024. So all of these things mean that now America is not contingent only upon buying through a TV broadcaster something like the Premier League, even though we've seen that do really well with NBC. The priority is also to grow the league in the build up to the World Cup. And there's no reason why a country as big as America can't do better than they did when the last World Cup came to America. Obviously, this one is also Canada and Mexico, but if we're specifically speaking about the United States of America, there was no real legacy, there was no real impact after the World Cup that came to America in the 90s. And now the hope is that things will change. So this isn't only about a business model whereby the Premier League and other leagues establish themselves in America and make Americans watch it and battle against time differences and battle against other sports. This is also about trying to get a collective business strategy from all of US soccer so that once we hit the World Cup and after the World Cup, that market is stronger and it has a legacy that wasn't there in the 90s and attracts more players. And then you've got a situation again where a lot of players may feel that it's safer to go to America because you could actually move early. And if the coaching standards are right, you go through the collegiate system. So if you make it, great. And if you don't make it, then you've got a fallback. You've got an education. You've got pathways both for a positive and a negative outcome. And that's something America does much, much better, I think, than any other country in the world, because it's just not a thing in Europe to go to university while still playing football, but it's absolutely a thing to do so in America. So that's a window of opportunity, and that helps the MLS and other leagues grow because they're connected to the collegiate system, much like in other US sports as well. So there's a window of opportunity in the next few years for America to really stamp its authority within the soccer market rather than only rely on buying European soccer and presuming that's what its audience wants to see. I think that there's a fair argument to say that MLS's aspiration, much like Saudi's aspiration, is to eventually try and become one of the top 10 leagues in the world. And having a World Cup in 2026 along with Canada and Mexico can definitely help in that goal.
I agree. And I think there's a segment of the population in America coming from Mexico, from Latin America, that is driving a lot of interest in soccer. Why? And I saw some stat, I just don't remember the numbers, but some games from Liga Mexico have more audience than the Champions League. So think about that, so that's going to help grow the game. And as you said, if they are able to grow the league internally, that's just going to compound over time. No? Now that you were speaking about dominance, let's get back to Europe, no? And recently we saw the Lloyd Money League be published, where we saw that teams from the EPL. So there was in the top 20, there were 8 teams, where I think last year it was more than that. So I'm just thinking, and especially because we've seen call it an atypical transfer window where Premier League clubs have not invested as much. Do you think the dominance of the Premier League at some point, is it at risk? I know not in the short term, but medium to long term with all these dynamics, is that going to be a thing to watch?
Potentially. I think that the Premier League position is that financial rules, and La Liga would argue the same as well, have held clubs back. But that's a good thing because the whole point of stringent rules is to be sustainable. If you're not sustainable and you spend and you spend and you spend, then eventually it's going to lead to disaster. So new domestic spending rules, such as profit and sustainability in the Premier League, and wider financial rules, such as financial fair play, could change the landscape and mean that for the Premier League, window on window on window, this dominant spending stops. And if that's the case, then naturally you make less signings and you may be able to pay them less money. And the Premier League would argue that although they want to be dominant, they don't want to set clubs up for financial ruin. And UEFA and La Liga, Javier Tebas in particular, would argue that the more strict the financial rules are, the more level the playing field becomes. And that's when, for example, if Saudi choose to spend and spend and spend from centralized ministry funds, they may be able to offer such appealing transfer funds or wages that they can shake up the market and they can get elite level players. But I don't think the Premier League fears losing its position, being at the top of the pyramid. And I also think that a quiet January window that we've just seen from the Premier League, where Ligue 1 actually outspent the Premier League, which was quite surprising, is probably still an anomaly, because it wasn't just down to clubs being concerned about profit and sustainability rules in light of charges against Everton and Nottingham Forest, and we know obviously about the 115 Manchester City charges as well. I think it's just been a strange inflation in the market because there's been high demand over certain players and big spending that took place last summer and planned spending that's due in the forthcoming summer. And remember, January is a quick window and it's a seller's market anyway. So we're maybe warped, because if you look at not the last January, but the one before that, Chelsea single-handedly signed about 8 players for about 350 million. So everyone suddenly thinks, wow, Premier League clubs, look at that dominance. But that's Chelsea alone. And if you discount Chelsea, that was perhaps not the busiest window either. So I wouldn't be judging things on January. And then if you look at the previous summer, Chelsea, for example, signed Moises Caicedo and Romeo Lavia and spent another 300 million. Manchester United signed Mason Mount and Andre Onana, which was above the 100 million or so that they wanted to spend, and a few other additions came in. And remember, it's not just senior additions, you've got youth additions, you've got women's team additions. They all eat into parts of the budget. Yes, separated parts of the budget, but ultimately they impact on your overall business costs nonetheless. Arsenal brought in Declan Rice and Jurrien Timber and Kai Havertz. That was 200 plus million. So when you've had that big spend, it would be normal that the market slows down. And it's very easy to look at one window or a few windows alone and say, wow, there's a changing in trend. There's a different dynamic. But the reality is that if you have a big window and then you still need to spend in the next January window, maybe you're doing something wrong. Because the whole point of sustained spending or big spending is you are meant to level off. So you'd expect it for every club, and potentially league-wide, if big clubs are all spending at the same time, to have these fluxes. So I don't think the Premier League are too concerned in terms of its clubs, and I don't think the league is that worried about new financial rules because they're the ones that are driving them. I think the league's worry is more about the independent regulator and how that is going to impact on their position in the market, because they would deep down rather have self-governance. So then if we look at the forthcoming summer, I think we're going to see more big spending. I think midfielders like Rice and Caicedo were the big story for Premier League clubs. And seemingly to get any midfielder, you needed about 100 million. Then January, it's a lull, but that to me is not necessarily a pattern. I think that January might be the exception because there's all of these different reasons why it was a quiet January. And then as we head into the summer, I think that battle for midfielders from last summer is going to turn into a big money battle for strikers, the likes of Ivan Toney and Victor Osimhen. And again, we'll realise these Premier League clubs do have money and are prepared to spend them. And as a consequence, it should be business as usual as far as spending is concerned in the market.
Yeah, that brings me back to a conversation I had with Stephen Mandis on the podcast. He's author of books like The Real Madrid Way. He's an advisor to FIFA. And one of the things he was saying is that effectively the Premier League is a super league. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, the Premier League is a super league of sorts. It just depends how you define it. I mean, it's a super league in the sense that it's the best league and it's got the infrastructure and the commercial income and the clout and the quality on the football side and the brands. So add all of that up and of course it's a super league of sorts, but it is also a domestic league. So if we strictly define the Super League, the whole point of the Super League is that it's meant to combine to allow for European competition. So we don't just see a Manchester derby or an El Clasico, we see Manchester United versus Barcelona and Real Madrid, because that's the belief from the organisers that young audiences want to see cross-European competition and rivalries. And they think that that's feasible in the modern era where transportation is not an issue and teams are used to travelling. So I don't think we can quite call the Premier League a super league, except very broadly and superficially in the sense that it's the best league in the world. But it's different strategies. The Premier League is ultimately about domestic competition and meritocracy, and it's connected to the pyramid in England. And the appeal is arguably in the fact that you've got 20 teams that on their day, regardless of if they're top or bottom, can be competitive. And some of the worst teams in the league statistically can cause upsets. And some of the best teams in the league can wow us and have appeal to everybody, not just fans of that team, and can go out there, as Manchester City proved last season, and win silverware in Europe. But the key difference is the Super League is trying to disrupt again. It's trying to give us fixtures that we've not seen before, and in doing so, provide a stability to clubs across Europe in terms of their regularity of European football, which is why the model is now a tiered-based system to allow for 60 to 80 clubs rather than just a closed competition for the elite brands, historically at least. So they're different, but it's absolutely true that the Premier League has become a Super League in the sense that each aspect of it at the moment is more stable than any other league in the world. There's bigger money, there's better competition, there's bigger wages, there's bigger transfer fees, and add all of that up. And it is very hard for the other European leagues to compete. But I don't think it's strictly a Super League because it is ultimately intent on staying a competitive domestic league connected to the English pyramid based upon meritocracy, whereas what the Super League is looking to do is introduce an entirely new format that will distribute wealth in that new format in a completely different way to the Premier League.
And one of the promises of the Super League, now they're on point, imagine this happens, no? That it becomes a reality. One of the promises is that it's going to distribute around 5 billion to its clubs. And do you think that's feasible? Because that's a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, this 5 million distribution is not necessarily something that we can preempt at this point with a Super League, because we don't know where the money's coming from, to be perfectly frank with you. Whereas with the Premier League, the distribution per clubs is very reliable because we've got lots of history to look at in terms of television rights, and also how the Premier League clubs, by being part of the Premier League, can piggyback off the brand, and then new income streams like the Premier League Summer Series in America, all of which allow you to make quite an accurate projection as a club as to what you're going to get by being a part of the Premier League. With the Super League, the original funding was from JP Morgan, and it was a loan on relatively preferable terms to the tune of about 4 billion quid or 5 billion US dollars. And the feeling was that the original founding members would all get a kind of joining bonus. And that joining bonus could have been up to $1 billion US dollars each per club. Now, the maths doesn't quite add up only off the loan, but obviously the joining bonus promised was through lots of different either actual partners or potential partners, whereas the loan itself was not only to just give to the clubs, it was about also the infrastructure needed to start the league. So we shouldn't see the 5 billion number as the maximum number the Super League needed to help fund the clubs and fund their own league. It was like a starting loan almost. And the joining bonus, as it was called, was very appealing, in particular to Barcelona and Real Madrid, because it allowed them to kind of balance the books. But it's also important to note that those close to the Super League have always maintained that that number was not over one season. It was a kind of cyclical bonus to say you join, you get that bonus up front, and then you commit to staying in the Super League. I think it was for 5 seasons or something in that ballpark. So then you can actually divide that number by 5 if that's the case, rather than saying that it was $1 billion every single season. But the discrepancy between the instant money, whatever the terms were, versus what some of the clubs, particularly those in Spain, were earning was massive. So it was a no-brainer, therefore, for Barcelona and Real Madrid to say, we want to join, not only because they're the two clubs driving it, along with at the time Juventus, but overnight they could have basically given themselves financial security. Whereas I think that it was a harder sell for the Premier League clubs, which is why they thought long and hard, many of them, before committing and eventually pulling out, because they're well aware that they're getting good money anyway from the Premier League, but more importantly, they're getting stability of income. And it's all very well accepting something and joining a new project and getting one massive payment up front. But then if the project doesn't work, you leave yourself in almost financial limbo because you might have sacrificed other payments. And that's the big underrated thing with the Super League that was never widely discussed. The organisers pushed numbers that suggested it was viable, but there was also in many ways lost income for clubs joining the Super League because maybe their leagues would try and force them out. Or obviously, if you join the Super League, you're missing out on Champions League. So if you take this number of 1 billion, but you say Barcelona, Real Madrid are no longer going to be in the Champions League, you have to discount the income that they're gaining from the Champions League from the income that they're gaining by joining the Super League, which means the overall profit, if you like, by switching is not as big as sometimes is painted.
Yeah, agree. And if you have time for one more rapid question, I mean, I'm thinking, when you look at, for example, the broadcasting landscape, it seems it's plateaued, no? Because even though the Premier League has just signed an agreement with overall more value, when you look at the average, let's say, income per game, that's actually lower. Serie A has also signed a deal that's actually lower. So I'm just thinking from a sport business model perspective, do you think something like the Super League is what's needed to kind of like bring the value of rights up again, or even everything related to in-stadium experiences and attendance?
Well, I think the leagues would argue a Super League brings the rights value down. So, of course, if you had all these big fixtures, the specific TV revenue for a Super League might be equivalent to, or I'm sure the organisers would argue, bigger than the Champions League. It's very easy for them to say that when it's all only on paper. But clubs are not only looking at one rights valuation, they're looking at total income. So that's money from European football plus money from domestic rights. And if you join a Super League and you make more, let's just say hypothetically, than the Champions League, but then rights holders say, we now think the Premier League rights valuation is lower, because even if you stay in your domestic league, if you're playing more games in the Super League midweek, maybe you're going to be fielding less of your stars the days that follow, because you're going to have to balance extra European games. I know the Super League will say that it's the same calendar weeks, but the feeling is it's more games than the Champions League because it's more guaranteed games for all of the sides involved because the format is different. So I think everybody in the original plans is guaranteed at least 7 games. And if you end up going all the way, you'll play more games than you do in the Champions League. So maybe then rights holders will say, we think that the Premier League product or the La Liga product will be devalued because of the fact that clubs are going to have to balance a more congested fixture calendar, and therefore some of the games we're not going to see the likes of Erling Haaland, or if it's Ligue 1, Kylian Mbappe playing week in, week out as often in their domestic leagues. They might be rested 5 times more a season, and people might want the price to go down. Plus, we still don't know the dynamic because there's a back and forth and it's constantly fought out in legal courts and things like this. So we don't know whether the leagues will find a way to block ultimately players playing in the Super League, or vice versa, whether they'll find a way that they can conflict their own calendar with the Super League itself. And that would bring down the rights valuation of a domestic league. So maybe legally they can't say we're going to kick Manchester United or Chelsea out of our league, but the league can still schedule things whenever they want. So what if hypothetically the league moved a Manchester derby to a Wednesday night to directly coincide with a Super League game where Manchester United were also playing? Then you have a decision to make. Which game do you want to field your stars in? And of course, eventually it will all get resolved. And eventually we might get a situation like with Live Golf, where there is some kind of merger or the different organizations work together. But the reality of the situation is that rights will not just go up because of the Super League succeeding if it gets off the ground. Domestic rights could go down because of it as well, and clubs have to consider that.
Yeah, agreed. Final question, if I can, and just in a tweet, I just need to get this out of you. Your thoughts on the Manchester United takeover?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Jim Ratcliffe with obviously a minority stake, but sporting control, and he's the most significant person at the club. So at the time we're recording this, final ratifications are being completed. And I think it's going to be fascinating because Ratcliffe doesn't just see this as a project. He sees this as his legacy and passion. And I think that because of that, it means he's going to invest everything. And I expect him to succeed at Manchester United. I expect him to revolutionise the club from top down. So Omar Barada is a flagship appointment, sporting director to come as well. And if they get the structure right, then there'll be football success that follows. Whereas previous Manchester United executives have constantly looked at football failure and been cutthroat with the manager first. And I think that Ineos are thinking strategy first, not football first, in order to get football success. And that's why I think that they'll be a huge success at Manchester United.
And I think football needs Manchester United to be a top club once again. And I think we need it. So, Ben, this has been awesome. So much fun. We need to bring you back. Can people follow you? You want to...
You can follow me at Jacobs Ben on X.
You're fantastic. So we will speak again soon, Ben.
I look forward to it.
Bye. There you have it, Ben Jacobs. I love these kind of episodes where we just go around the world looking at the football industry and everything that's going on. And the thing is, we're at such a fun time around the industry. You know, you have Saudi, you have the MLS, you have everything that's going on in Europe. You know, I found some key or interesting things that Ben said, you know, that you should keep in mind as well. For instance, when we talked about Saudi, I really like that concept of the direct-to-fan proposition that he was speaking of. It is true that Saudi doesn't have, I guess, the pressure to sign major broadcasting deals just yet. Also, maybe they can actually invest in the long term and do their own D2C proposition, which is actually going to let them have more power over fans' data and personalized service. Then when you go into the MLS, I mean, the key obviously is to have an inner league grow strongly. For it to be an interest that is sustainable over time. And finally, when you look into Europe, I mean, the Premier League obviously is not going to be still, right? I mean, even if this quest for profitability might, let's say, slow down or their dominance because they're not going to be able to sign top players or maybe retain them as much, it is true that they have very solid foundations. And when you have, you know, clubs like Manchester United attempting to make a comeback, Chelsea, I mean, overall, you believe that, you know, the Premier League is going to be a top league for years to come, right? And anyway, I just hope you found this interesting. I definitely learned a lot from Ben. I'm sure we're going to have him back. Just let us know if anything stood out to you. If you like these type of episodes, if you want us to do more of these in the future, just so reach out on social media. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast on your platform of choice. It does help, you know, for us to get discovered by new football industry leaders out there. And of course, feel free to share with your industry colleagues. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the World Football Summit podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. I had a ton of fun, and I hope you learned something new today. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you next time.